Beautiful. Well, we all have a little bit of a sense of what it means to be Jewish at Bethel, but what does it mean to be Jewish in America? This is a question that's concerned our parents for sure. No doubt it concerns all of us, otherwise you wouldn't be here tonight. And hopefully it's a question that's going to concern our kids. So I'm Ira Silver, and I want to welcome you. I'm the chair of adult education. Tonight, along with me is Steve Balsack from the committee, who's going to be handling the technology. I appreciate, Steve, your help tonight as well. So tonight is part two of a conversation that we started about 10 days ago, which is meant to be both educational and hopefully action-oriented as well. And in that initial conversation we had a week ago Wednesday was a kind of an overview that I gave of the report that came out in 2020 based on research by Pew, and it's called Jewish Americans in 2020. And being here tonight is not required that you were at that earlier presentation, and it's also not required that you read the report. But since I know that you're going to want some good bedtime reading after you leave here tonight, I'm going to put it in the chat. There it is. So we're going to be referring to this report, and really not so much the findings as it is the implications of those findings. We had a rich conversation in that first discussion we had, where people that were there generated many fascinating questions for tonight's speaker. We're really pleased to have Professor Len Saxe, who is an advisor to the Pew study. Professor Saxe is the Klutznick Professor of Contemporary Jewish Studies and Social Policy at Brandeis, trained as a social psychologist, and he's an expert on sort of all the kinds of things that this report speaks to regarding American Jewry, religious identity, engagement with Israel, anti-Semitism, and other types of concerns that will be part of our conversation tonight. Professor Saxe has many accolades. I'm not going to sort of take your time to kind of go through all of them, but if I had to pick one that was particularly meaningful to me as a scholar who thinks it's important for our work to be kind of in the public interest, he received the American Psychological Association's award for distinguished contributions to psychology in the public interest. So he has the data, the insight, and the capacity to shed light on topics that are really central to our concerns as Jews and as members of this congregation. So I welcome you, Professor Saxe. Please take over. Professor Len Saxe, welcome. It's great to have you here.
So great to be with you. Shavua Tov, everyone. Thank you, Rabbi Josh, your family. Ira, thank you for that wonderful introduction. And just pleased to be with you, and hopefully have an engaging conversation as best we can do over Zoom. I see a few people whose names I recognize. Hello, and sorry I haven't seen you, talked to you in a while. But again, I look forward to the discussion. So I titled this The Myth of the Vanishing Jew, and I'll tell you in a second what the sort of the program is. But I'm going to base my comments this evening on the Pew study. I'm going to show you some pictures, some data pictures from the study. It's been informed a bit by notes that Ira gave me of the discussion 10 days ago. So I hope I can address some of the questions that were posed, some of the issues that were discussed in that. But then we can open it up. At the end of my presentation, I'm going to suggest a couple of directions that the conversation might go in. Just to set the table here, the Pew study was a survey of U.S. Jews. In order to find Jews, you got to survey tens of thousands of other people to find out who isn't Jewish. It's a methodologically sophisticated study. It goes in parallel with studies, many of which I do with my colleagues at Brandeis, local Jewish community studies, including our study of Boston in 2015. We're currently doing studies in almost 10 communities around the country. So some of the context for my comments about Pew will be based on what I'm learning and what I have learned very recently. Importantly, the Pew data were collected almost entirely before March, April of 2020, so before COVID. But it provides the background to understand the contemporary situation. Based on what I'd planned to do and the notes that Ira provided me, I'm going to talk about a series of narratives that are out there about the American Jewish community, the assimilation continuity narrative, this issue of who are we as Jews? Are we a religious group? Are we an ethnic group? Are we just a culture that we pick and choose the pieces that that resonate with us? And I'm going to talk about the diversity of the community, both in attitudes and behavior. Let me start, though, with the myth of the vanishing Jew. So goes back decades. 1963 was made very public with a cover story in Look magazine, 1963, about the vanishing American Jew. And at that time, in the 1960s, people were predicting that by the year 2000, the only Jews left in America would be Orthodox Jews, that congregations like Bethel would not exist. Well, in fact, what Pew documents, and it is consistent with other work, the work that my group does at Brandeis, American Jewish Population Project, the population, the American Jewish population, adults and children, is now somewhere in the neighborhood of 7.5 million. The population has grown by more than 36% since since 1990, and even since 2013, the population has grown by 10%. One of the things that Pew does, or I hoped it would do, is put an end to the disappearing narrative so that we could actually focus on enriching Jewish life. We'll talk a little bit about the fact that the narrative is still out there, and we'll also talk about some of the reasons why the narrative was incorrect. So just again, to set the table here, the American Jews that are, I'm going to use the expression counted, it's a statistical estimation, are first of all those people who, when you ask them, what is your religion, if any, they say that Judaism is their religion. And they have Jewish parentage or Jewish education, they've converted. But it also includes those who say they're agnostic, they're atheists, they're secular, Hebrew term Hiloni, but they have also Jewish parentage, education, etc. It includes children who are being raised Jewish by religion, or some parents say we're not giving the child religious education, but we're raising them culturally Jewish, includes them. Importantly, it includes almost 3 million people who could claim Jewish identity if they wanted to, but don't consider themselves Jewish, and they don't have even another religion. Some do have another religion. The definition, and I want to be clear, there's been some recent discussion. I'll later on put in the chat an op-ed that I wrote just last week about this, and how Israelis and the Israeli government views American Jewry. But the definition of who is a Jew hasn't in America changed. It's been stable over a long period of time. The growth is genuine growth. Now, the study makes a distinction between, I want to call them types of Jews, but two different ways of identifying as Jewish in America. One is by religion. You say that your religion is Judaism. This is across the board. About 3/4 of the adult Jewish population, only adults answered the survey. More people who are older say that their religion is Judaism. Fewer say they're agnostic, atheist, secular, cultural. They don't identify religiously. More young people identify as the acronym JBR or JNR rather than JBR compared to older groups. We don't yet know whether that's going to be stable over time or it's just a piece of what in psychology we call emerging adulthood, experimenting. This is how people identify by denomination. And what is interesting, not shown here, but the comparison, 1990, the largest and most important in many respects denomination movement was the conservative movement. Close to 40% of American Jews identified as part of the Masorti, the conservative movement. The Reform movement membership was considerably smaller. And if you look here just at the net Jewish, on my screen it shows as the light blue 37%. The Reform movement is now the largest denominational movement. Orthodox are almost 10%, but not even 10%. And the conservative movement has essentially lost more than half of its of the people who who are part of the American Jewish community. And I'll show you a bit about that, more about that in a second. The one caveat I would put on these pictures is that you have to remember that the base is much greater today than it was in 1990. So the decline, for example, in the conservative movement, quite as dramatic in terms of the number of people, because we are 36% or more larger as a group than we were. The 37% that's represented by the Reform movement is an even larger number than it seems, again, because the population has expanded. By the way, if I'm not being clear, or there are questions of clarification or something, you want to put those in the chat, and then Ira can interrupt me, and I'm glad to go back and and give you some further explanation. So one of the dynamics, and one of the back to the narrative that began decades ago about the vanishing American Jew, was that intermarriage was going to be the end of American Judaism, that essentially we were going to assimilate ourselves out of existence as Jews married non-Jews. Now, in fact, intermarriage is increasingly, especially amongst the non-Orthodox, becoming a normative fact of life. And as you see on the right-hand side, in the last 10 years, amongst non-Orthodox married Jews, over 70% were marriages to non-Jews. But what happened is that over time, there was a fundamental change in intermarriage. One of the reasons is because beginning in 1978, policies followed in the 1980s, the Reform movement welcomed intermarried families and focused on providing Jewish education to the children of intermarried parents. And I'm not going to show it here. Basically, what's happened is that since 1980, the vast majority of the children of intermarried parents identify as Jews. The children identify as Jews even when they become adults. And that rate has increased by more than 100% from the generation born after 1980 compared to the generations born before 1980. So when in the 1960s and the 1970s, people said it was the end of Judaism, liberal Judaism in America, they weren't incorrect based on the facts at that time. Once the Reform movement, but a whole bunch of other things happened, Jewish education was transformed. You had programs like Birthright Israel that came along, increasing numbers of young people we don't use intermarried in our work, we use one Jewish parent families. The situation totally changed. And so now, today, intermarriage, there are other factors as well, but intermarriage is actually leading to, or is one of the dynamics of the increasing size of the American Jewish community. There's also immigration. There's also the fact that with greater acceptance, anti-Semitism, recent anti-Semitism aside, has allowed more people to remain Jewish or encourage more people to remain Jewish. I'm just going to show you one indicator of the current situation, and that is how are Jewish children or how being raised. And what you see here is, and look at the bottom two bars, with two Jewish parent families, a Jewish spouse, virtually all children are being raised as Jewish, almost all by religion, a smaller number, if you will, culturally. Very few are being raised in something else. In intermarried families, there's a substantial proportion, 28%, who are being raised Jewish by religion. Generally, that means that they're members of synagogues, children are getting explicit Jewish education. There's another close to 30%, though, that are being raised Jewish. They consider their children Jewish. They're celebrating the holidays, etc., but they're not giving them explicit Jewish education. Only 30% are being raised not Jewish. Typically today, it doesn't mean that they're being raised Christian or Muslim or Mormon or some other religion. It means completely without religion. So now I want to shift and I want to talk about, okay, what is it that Jews do and how do they express their Judaism? This is a complicated table. Later on, we can talk about the details of it. The simple explanation of this table is that we use statistics to organize or to identify based on the responses to the survey. This is the Pew survey, of course, patterns of engaging in Jewish life. So there's one pattern all the way over on the right-hand side. We call it immersed. About 15% of the total population. And these are people who are ritually engaged in Judaism. They're communally engaged in Judaism. You see what measures we're using, and they're culturally engaged in Judaism. Almost all of the Orthodox or a large proportion of the Orthodox are in this group, but it also includes Reform Jews and conservative Jews and even the Jews of no denomination. There's another group that has high levels, but not as high as the immersed. We call them the involved. There's another group called the holiday Jews. They do some services, Some are synagogue members, or many are synagogue members. They donate to Jewish organizations. They're culturally involved, but it's a different pattern of engagement in different ways of Jewish life. Let me just go all over now all the way to the left, the minimally involved. So there are about a quarter of American Jews. It turns out they're proud to be Jews. They're proud of their heritage. They're not ashamed to say that they're Jewish, but most of them don't do a lot of Jewish stuff. But it's only 25% or so of the group. There's another group that does Jewish, but they do it outside, I'll call it, of the institutional context. These are people who are very involved, in many cases, in culture, but it's all personal. It's not necessarily with other people. And one of the reasons that we look for these patterns is that denomination no longer is a good way to figure out the different ways that people engage with their identities. And I'm going to quickly show you some of the implications of this. So there's one question: how important is being Jewish in your daily life? And what you see here is that almost everybody is except for some of the folks in that minimal group, everybody thinks that being Jewish is at least somewhat important in their lives. Almost half think that being Jewish is very important in their lives. What's also interesting, and I'm trying now to get at what are the differences in how people engage in being Jewish, and what are the key things that are associated with that. And when you ask people what's essential to your being Jewish, these groups have very different patterns. So being part of the Jewish community is key for many folks, except for the folks in that minimal group. Observing Jewish law is what distinguishes most of the community from those who are Orthodox and immersed. But again, remember that in the immersed category, you have people not just who are Orthodox, but Reform and Conservative and no denomination as well. One of the questions is, what are the differences amongst you? Clearly, we differ as a Jewish people in our relationship to commandedness, to ritual observance. But what do we agree on? And both the Shoah, the Holocaust, and leading an ethical and moral life, I'm going to say, are near universal amongst all Jews. The same, belonging to the Jewish people is also key across the groups. Again, the minimal group is somewhat different, but it's a relatively small group. It's by no means the majority of the group. And you see the divergence on the other side in terms of level of attachment to Israel. I'm going to talk about that in just 1 second. So we're now at that second, so I'll talk about attachment to Israel. The issue of attachment to Israel is really a question, or it's closely related to have you ever visited Israel. So close to half of American Jewish adults have visited Israel. And what you see here is that they have very, very different views, or very different level of attachment to Israel than those who haven't. Now, those of you who understand that correlation is not causation, obviously, if you go to Israel, you may be going because you have a sense of attachment. And that's true. But what we're able to demonstrate is that going to Israel has an independent effect. And some of the best data, and now I'm going to take some data from the Pew study about something I study intimately and know intimately, and that is Birthright Israel. So we looked in the Pew study. There were some questions about whether people had participated in Birthright Israel. Those who don't know, it's a 10-day, quote unquote, free program that brings young adults to Israel, 18 to 27. Turns out that Birthright has taken hundreds of thousands of young people. In the Pew study, if you were 45 years old or younger, you were eligible for Birthright. A lot of the people, like 18 to 25, didn't yet have a chance to go on Birthright. But even so, over a fifth of the respondents had been on Birthright Israel. One of the interesting things is that the majority of non-Orthodox individuals who had ever traveled to Israel traveled on Birthright. Nearly a third of the Birthright alumni are the children of one Jewish parent. Now, what's important about Birthright is that unlike other programs, especially other programs that cost money, that you have to pay to go on, Birthright actually attracted a whole bunch of people who didn't previously feel a sense of attachment to Israel, who didn't previously have either Israel education or Jewish education, and so on. And so it gives us a better picture of what, or better sense, better ability to figure out what is the impact of the program. And as you can see here, in terms of emotional attachment, so I showed you the findings before overall, the big difference between the people who had gone and not. But here, amongst the people who were non-Orthodox and had been eligible for Birthright, pretty huge differences in attachment, even though it includes people who you would not have predicted would be attached to Israel based on their education and background. And we've done more complex statistical analyses and can show that there's an independent effect of going to Birthright when you compare people, similar levels, similar kinds of backgrounds. So now these are just throwing out what I hope are interesting findings from this study. A couple of comments, and then we'll turn it over to your questions and discussion. So the first takeaway is that we're not vanishing. American Jewish community is growing. The Reform movement has the largest market share. The Reform movement, which gets a lot of critique, also deserves a lot of credit for making this happen, and making it possible, in particular, for one Jewish parent families to feel part of the Jewish community, and their children and spouses to feel part of the Jewish community. There's a lot of diversity in how people express their Judaism, ritual, culture, community. There are lots of differences in attitudes and practices and ways to engage. This is what I hope will be our discussion. But the study, my favorite expressions is that demography is not destiny. The fact that we find so many people who are not doing, but are, say, minimally engaged or only engaged in very personal ways and not community ways, institutional ways with Judaism, not engaged with Israel, whatever, those are facts on the one hand. On the other hand, there are opportunities to engage people. If you will, the ball is in our court. And we've got lots of evidence now that engagement can be enhanced by meaningful programs. I can talk about them. I say here that programs that touch the heart, mind, and body. I I have this thing I call it the Kishkis cortex and kinesthetics principle, that Jewish education that engages you intellectually, emotionally, and behaviorally, we know works. That's why camps and things like Birthright have the kind of effects that they do. And I think particularly for a community like Bethel, one of the issues is how do you meet the needs across the lifespan? Jewish education isn't just for kids, and developing the sense of community, of Hebrew Amiyut, the sense of peoplehood, of connection to people, both to Jews, both past, present, and future, gets expressed differently across the lifespan. And one of the tricks, one of the strategy issues is how to do that in a community. So thank you, and I look forward to your questions, your comments, and the discussion.
Len, thank you. On behalf of everyone here, I really appreciate your digging into the data and giving us some insight, some interpretation. I want to just make one kind of overall sort of observation that came to mind for me. This is not going to be news to you at all, for sure, Len, but it might be. I think it's important for everyone here to think about. I have a barking dog in the background here. And then I want to add a question onto that. And before I do either of those, I want to remind everyone, please put your questions in the chat, either to me or to everyone, but not to Bethel, and then I'll get to them. The kind of the observation I have is that you're talking to a room full of about 50 people. So we all know when there's 50 Jews, there's at least as many opinions, but not to make a joke of it. I mean, I think all of us sort of have our own quote data on this topic. I mean, all of us sort of come to it, and I'm sure you deal with this all the time, that everyone has their own experience as a Jew, and maybe it has something to do with fear or being a minority. This vanishing Jew narrative is something that many people believe, and I think you're giving us good reason to question it, but there's something kind of I don't know, almost visceral about that belief. And so I guess I think it's important that we kind of reckon, all of us, with our own internal sense of that our own experience is may not cohere with the data you're giving us, and there may be reasons why our experiences are biased, and maybe that's why there's been, at least for going on 60 years now, this kind of vanishing Jew narrative. But with that said, I wanted to ask you, I mean, the topic that got the most attention when we had the meeting 10 days ago, and where people were, I think, were the most animated and the most, perhaps using their own sort of experiences, and particularly their experience with their kids, as kind of a data point for the sort of the way the world of the future of American Judaism looks, is obviously the issue of intermarriage and assimilation. And I'm wondering if you would just kind of go a little further with that and dig in a little bit, because I inferred from what you said, and you didn't say it in these words, but that you might be suggesting, and this might be too bold a way of saying it, but I'll say it provocatively so you can respond, that intermarriage, because of birthright, because of a greater welcoming ethos in congregations to intermarried couples, maybe because of summer camp, maybe because of other factors, that intermarriage nowadays, actually, contrary to what people fear, is actually more of an opportunity than a threat. And I'm curious how you would respond to that, or just give us more of an interpretation, if you would, about how you see intermarriage.
Well, let me go back to your first question, though, because I think the context here is important. For those of you who know the work of Danny Kahneman, the social psychologist, Nobel Prize laureate, who writes about cognitive, how we see the world differently, and basically a cognitive psychologist. One of his observations is that we privilege our personal experience. So people who are adults today, when they think of Jewish education, they think of the Hebrew school experience that they had when they were children. They think of, if they were born in the 60s or the 50s or the 70s, they think of the discussion then, and they think of what camps were like, and what synagogues were like, and so on. And one of the advantages of research is that it helps us understand experiences which aren't ours and different experiences. Now, specifically with intermarriage, it is very definitely an opportunity. I would encourage everybody to read Rabbi Alexander Schindler's 1978 speech, where he talked about how troubled he was by intermarriage. He said, no one in America, no rabbi in America cares as much about the future of the Jewish people and is pained to see intermarriage. He said, but we can't continue to schrei Gewalt and just throw up our hands. We have to think of what we can do, in particular to educate the next generation. And that power is not only is it there, but it's ever present. So it is an opportunity. I mean, the irony of this is that from a mathematical perspective, from a pure demographic perspective, intermarriage is actually advantageous. Why waste two Jews marrying to produce 1.9 children when you can have one Jew marry someone who's not Jewish and they can produce 1.9 children? That's a gain of 0.9 of a child, and being silly about it. But to the extent that we can make Judaism and being part of a Jewish community, which is what Judaism is really about, meaningful. In fact, the future is bright. We can talk more. It's not just welcoming, but let me take some other questions, and I'll come back to why welcoming is not necessarily the best way to think about what we need to do as a community to engage those in intermarried families.
We can just stick with this topic for a second. Gail Kazin, I want to invite into the conversation. She had a question about intermarriage.
Sure.
Gail, you can feel free to ask it if you want, or I can ask it for you.
Okay. Hi, Len, thank you. The question that I posed was, if someone intermarries, but they have no affiliation with synagogue, don't feel particularly attached to Israel or summer camp, do we know how they raise their children? Because I think that those who intermarry who are part of synagogue is a different group of people than those who intermarry and have little attachment to their weekly or monthly Judaism.
But we do know some things, but I don't know, this Churchill never give up. One of the things that I know for sure from studying Birthright, and we've done essentially a clinical trial with Birthright, is that even children who grew up in households where their parents weren't part of a congregation, they got no exposure to the community, to Judaism in a formal sense, an experience like Birthright puts them on the trajectory of engagement. And in fact, they're more likely to, when they establish their own families, to be part of synagogues, to raise Jewish children, etc. So part of the challenge is how to provide meaningful experiences for Jewish families, including families where there is only one Jewish adult, and we don't have experiments. We don't have the RCTs that you might have in a drug trial, but we have an awful lot of experience now to know that people can be engaged. We also now know much more about what keeps those families, those intermarried families from engaging, and you can use that information to develop, to do K-RUV, to do outreach. Does that help?
Len, if we
it helps, but it's really about birthright, and I'm not.
I'm not trying to say that it is birthright. I'm saying that that's the one that we have evidence for. You know, it's like with our COVID vaccines. Right now, we have evidence of 2 vaccines that work. Doesn't mean that there aren't other ways to do it. But in fact, the fact that these 2 vaccines both have, from a biological perspective, a similar approach, suggests other things that we can do. I think there are lots of other initiatives that can be done, but we only have data about systematic data about a few of them.
Len, there's a few different questions here that kind of cohere. I'll just maybe ask them and you can take them in whatever you see fit. Carolyn Schwartz asks, she says, you show a significant increase in reform movement participation, but this increase does not seem to have created increased participation in regular ritual practice by younger age Jews. Thus, membership in congregations in our area seem to be declining. And then Amy Yermish said, do we have any data about what reasons people express for choosing or not choosing various levels of engagement? She says she's curious about Reform Jews, how they can start to feel a more authentic connection with practice.
So I think Reform Jews in general don't feel the deep connection to ritual practice. I said to Ira, I hope this comes across in the right way, but I think it was the last time I was at Bethel. I was there for bar bat mitzvah. I don't even remember what, but I do remember driving in for the service on Saturday morning, and this crowd of people and cars leaving as those of us coming to the Simcha were entering. And at the time, there was a very active Torah study group. You know what? If you don't like to daven, that's fine. But the fact that people want to be part of Torah study and engage, that's Jewish practice. That's Judaism. And so I don't think ritual is necessarily the only indicator. I mean, we've moved beyond how many people light Shabbat candles as the indicator of Jewish practice, and instead, we look at how do you mark the beginning of Shabbat? Do you do it in a meaningful way? Part of the issue is that people haven't understood enough about these rituals. I'll also send a link to a piece I wrote many years ago for Reform Judaism. I got lots of critique, but I also got lots of very positive reactions. And it was a piece that was stimulated by doing a study on campus where we had interviewed a number of young Reform students who came out of Reform backgrounds who had gone to a Shabbat dinner when they got to campus their freshman year. And after Kiddush, they walked to the hand washing station following other people. And then on the way back from the hand washing station, started a conversation and nobody talked to them. And when they got to the table, they realized you don't do that. And they were so embarrassed, they were so mortified by having that experience that they never went back to Hillel. They never engaged again. And so I wrote this piece urging the Reform movement to teach ritual skills so that a Reform Jew can walk into a synagogue, walk into a Shabbat dinner, go to a shiva, and they understand the rituals, and they understand it enough in order to be able to make a choice about, this is a ritual that I want to participate in. This is a ritual that I don't want to participate in. But if you don't know what the rituals are and you don't know what the basis for it is, then you can't make the choice to do that. And then, so for me, it's an educational issue.
I want to invite Judy Goldberg to come to the conversation. Judy, you had a question about the kind of the category of being immersed and where that came from and the data.
It was just a kind of statistical question. Those immersed, involved, those categories seem to be, the immersed ones obviously did more than the less immersed ones. But what did you ask them, or did Pew ask them as a self-report, or were they put into those categories based on the behaviors they acknowledged?
Right, it's the latter. For those who are statistically inclined, we applied a statistical technique called latent class analysis. So we look at what they we look at what they say, and the program organizes, I'll make it as simple as possible, organizes them into patterns. So this is, and then we provide the names, we label them, we look at these behaviors. As you know, factor analysis, we have to come up with a name for it, and we try to come up with names that are descriptive but aren't, I don't know, pejorative, or aren't, don't get perceived negatively, that these are just different patterns. And we had to give it a name.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
Len, here's an angle on identity that we haven't talked about yet. So when I was a graduate student in sociology, I was at Northwestern University in the 90s. I had another graduate student who did his dissertation interviewing some of the real machers in the Chicago area. I think Jay Pritzker might have been one of them, others. And he was studying Jewish philanthropy. And the argument he made in his dissertation is that giving is either the major or a major, I don't recall, means by which many Jews think of themselves as Jewish. Now, granted, that was 25 years ago, but there was one question in the chat that asked about kind of what trends in giving are. And so that's more of a sort of a quantitative question about numbers, but I'm curious how you would react to kind of what place does giving to CJP and other sources figure into identity these days?
I think it used to be in Chicago. I mean, they're the classic place where, I don't know, this is probably not nice to say, so, but it's being recorded. I'll say it because you're not going to make this recording widely available. You know, Chicago is one of the places where money talks in terms of your ability or your role in the Jewish community. It is an exceptionally philanthropic community, but it's an exceptionally philanthropic community because it has a sizable group of very well-off people who are generous to the community. Philanthropy, unfortunately, I think Jewish philanthropy is two things happen. One is that federations, and CJP was the first federation. It was actually the model for United Way and non-Jewish collective philanthropies. It was supposed to obviate the problem of every Jewish organization having its own fundraising and asking people for money. Well, that's broken down in recent years because now, you know, on any given day, I get 25 solicitations from different organizations. I'm sure I'm not unique. So that's on the one hand. On the other hand, organizations, particularly Jewish federations, found that it was just as hard to raise, I don't know, $100,000 as it was to raise $1,000. And it'd be far better to, and I know some of the dynamics that went into these decisions, to find a few people who are willing to give $100,000 and $1 million gifts and the half shekel tradition that is represented in Judaism went by the wayside. So federations are raising a bit more than they used to raise, but from a significantly smaller group of people. At the same time, and this is why it's hard to figure out what's going on with philanthropy, people are now giving to many more organizations. You can't be a good member of the community without, I don't know, there are a dozen organizations that you give to. I live in two places, so I have to give to, or I feel an obligation to give to two Jewish federations. I have two congregations that I'm a part of, so I pay dues in two different places. So those kinds of things have happened. So it's a little bit hard to figure out what the trends are. The overall trends, and it has to do with the wealth and the success of people who are part of the Jewish community, is that Jewish philanthropy has never seen better days. And the overall budget of the Jewish community is we're talking billions of dollars and maybe even tens of billions of dollars.
Len, thank you. You made a point, not with respect to this question, but a couple of questions ago about, when you've been to Bethel and you notice that, lots of people are engaged, but not necessarily at services. I mean, the point is that they're getting into the building for whatever things are bringing us there. I want to ask Carolyn Schwartz, if you'd raise your question, because it has to do with kind of getting people to come to the building in the first place once we're open and running again. Carolyn?
Yeah. Yes, thank you. Very interesting conversation. My question is, can you make recommendations sort of along the lines of your mind, body, spirit analysis of why Birthright is so successful, about how we can get people to come to Shoals in the first place? Because if they don't come a first time, they're not going to come a second time.
So I would reframe the question. I don't think the question is how to get them to come to shul. I think the question is how to engage them in Jewish life. You know what? If everybody, if you organize Shabbat dinners where every member of the congregation, agreed a certain number of times per year to invite other Jewish families to Shabbat dinner, and you made those meaningful experiences, that's the gateway to getting them involved in an actual institution. So I think we have to think about it differently. And I also think, and I'll tell you what I did many years ago. I was called into a meeting with three prominent philanthropists, Edgar Bronfman of blessed memory, Lynn Schusterman, and Michael Steinhardt. And they were funding this synagogue program, Synagogue 2000, and then had some other name later on. And they wanted to know how to evaluate it. And anyway, and how to develop new programs. And for an hour or two, I sat around listening to them talk about synagogues. And probably not a nice thing to say, but it was clear that none of them liked synagogues. The only time they would go is, one I think even said, I guess I'll go on at my funeral. I'll be there. Another said, well, if I'm invited to a synagogue, I'll go. And so I said to them, well, the measure should be, what can the synagogue do to get people? It's actually in your question, to come into the building, not necessarily to go to shul, not necessarily to sit in services and daven. And I gave all of these examples, and out of that came a program called Cineplex, where synagogues did a whole bunch of different things to make doing Jewish things on Shabbat in particular part of their life. And I said, I don't care whether they do basketball or you run your Hebrew school instead of on Sunday, you run it on Shabbat. For most synagogues, that's not an issue. And as I said earlier, Torah study may be even more important than people actually participating in a service.
So we spoke a bit earlier about one of the big perceived existential threats, which obviously is intermarriage. And the other one, or at least one of the other ones, of course, is anti-Semitism. And it's curious to look at the Pew report. Obviously, the data were collected a couple of years ago, and there's been more recent incidents, namely Colleyville. And I guess one thing that struck me when I was reading through the report, and I mentioned this at the last meeting, that this is one of the places I actually quoted the report, where it said, quote, even among those who feel less safe, just 1 in 10 or 5% of all US Jews report that they have stayed away from a Jewish event or observance as a result. And I took that to mean, and I might be wrong, that even though this report is mostly data, there was kind of an interpretation here that people might think anti-Semitism is on the rise, but they're not sort of afraid to come out. And am I right on that interpretation, A? And B, are the data old, given what we've seen more recently?
No, you're absolutely correct. In the wake of Pittsburgh, Tree of Life synagogue, it actually increased the number of people who are going to synagogues in Pittsburgh, not just in other places. And one of the reasons, and actually I can show it to you if I can still share my screen, just pulled up one of the this from the slide, and actually the second bar here was a question that I had suggested and got included, and it is, why is there more anti-Semitism? And it's not that there are more people who are expressing anti-Semitism; it's that the people with anti-Semitic views feel more free to express them. Now, some of the, there is an increase. There's no question about that. But it's expression that has really, and the political climate has allowed them to express it. When studies are done, and when studies are done asking people whether they have personally experienced anti-Semitism, very few of us have certainly violent or physical anti-Semitism have experienced it. On the other hand, a swastika appears at a campus. An incident occurs at a synagogue, and the entire world knows about it almost instantaneously because of how the communication channels have changed. We're much more aware of incidents that we wouldn't have been aware of before. And I think this is one of the dynamics. The reason that people aren't afraid, we live in a violent country. We live in a country where kids get killed in schools, people get murdered in churches. There is clearly anti-Semitism. There is clearly violence directed against Jews, but few people have the direct experience of it, even though we all know about it to an extent that just never was possible before.
Really fascinating. Vivian, you've had your hand up for a long time. Thank you.
Hi. Thank you. I have two questions. One is the consequences of the identification. At the very beginning, you gave us three choices. Do I identify as a Jew culturally, or do I identify as a Jew racially, or do I identify religiously? And I'm just wondering, what are the so what? What are the consequences of a selection of identification, and how do you do you see it as an either or proposition? And what does that mean when it's either or, and what does it mean when it's both and? So culturally and religiously, or culturally and racially, or religiously and racially.
We try
how does
not
all that?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And then I have a second question.
Okay, we don't use racial. I mean, that was the Nazi frame of it. The way that, and in fact, I have another slide that I can show you. The way that Pew dealt with it is that they talk about. They asked a question. Do you believe you're being Jewish is mostly about religion, ancestry, or culture. And interestingly, even Orthodox Jews, while they, the vast majority see Judaism as religion, they see it as well as ancestry, and many see it as cultural. Whereas this is the one I'm showing you here is the reform that close to 2/3 of Reform Jews see Judaism as a culture and ancestry. So all three of these things are part of how people view their Jewish identity. Again, going back actually to the question about shul and ritual. Reform Jews, including those who are members of synagogues, see the cultural piece and even the ancestry piece as more important or more of them see it as important than the religion piece. Does that help? Yeah. You had a second question? I can.
Yes, my second question is about engagement and money. As a former synagogue president, I've wondered for a long time why we Jews are so shy about talking about money, and how valuable it is and how necessary it is, and we seem to talk about engagement as a substitute for the need for money to sustain and perpetuate the religion, because engagement is a very idiosyncratic individual choice and decision by individual and by family. And, it would be lovely if people can understand that our need to financially support institutional Judaism is separate and apart from our individual engagement with Jewish life in general and a synagogue in particular. Because without financial support, you're not going to have the teachers. You're not going to have the Hebrew school teachers. You're not going to have the scholars. You're not going to have the rabbis to perpetuate, the institution of the religion. I just don't, and there's just so much of a sort of a consumer mentality in synagogue membership, like, it's like a pay for service kind of thinking that's struggling for many. That's a challenge. That's a challenge for many synagogue leaders. And I just wonder how we can get this different kind of thinking, more widely accepted in Jewish communities.
Well, I think, you may not like my answer, so I'm going to try to be careful with my words here. Just like I wouldn't suggest that the goal is how to get people into the building. I understand that goal, etc. I think if you have people engaged, if people understand that this is meaningful, if people understand that being part of a community, that feeling a connection to other people, because of a shared culture, a shared set of values, a shared set of, I don't know, food preferences, whatever it is, that developing that will lead people to do the other stuff about sustaining a community. The two communities that I'm part of are minyanim. They're self-governing, self-run. So I said, I pay dues to two congregations, but I don't pay the same level of dues that I would if I were at a, called a bricks and mortar synagogue. But they're both very important to me. And I'm committed to the Jewish community. And so, I give to, the 100 other causes that I think are in the Jewish community that are worthy causes. But I think the engagement, and that's why I focus on it, the engagement precedes the other stuff. You have to have people who have internalized that this is an important part of their community, of who they are.
Len, there's a question on a topic I don't think we've discussed yet, and if we want to look toward a group that is doing things well, or at least seems to be doing things well, I don't know what the data say, is Chabad. So Barry David asked, what can we learn that might help sustain, grow Judaism in America? Does Chabad have lessons for Jews who identify in other ways than through Chabad?
Yeah, I think, first of all, the dedication of the rabbi and the rebbitzin, for them, Judaism, their job is a 24/7 job. The secret to Chabad, by the way, is that they give people one-way tickets. You leave Brooklyn with a one-way ticket to wherever you've been posted in the world, and that's where you are for life. And you have to build a community, etc. But I think in some ways they reflect what I was just saying about philanthropy. They approach people, they do outreach for people without requiring membership, without requiring dues payment. And the ask comes later, and it surely enough comes, and they're not hesitant to ask for it. But it doesn't precede their doing it. Now, Chabad, as successful as it is, it does attract significant numbers of Reform Jews, it mostly attracts people who are already engaged and looking for a different kind of experience.
So I want to be, firstly, incredibly thankful of the time you've given us, and you've been incredibly gracious with your time. If it's okay for just two more questions,
sure.
And then I'm, really appreciative. Conversation has covered a huge array of issues. Given that we're all meeting on Zoom, we would be, I think, remiss not to have a conversation about COVID. I want to ask my brother, David Silver, if he wants to raise his question about COVID.
So he's truly your brother?
He is truly my brother.
Okay.
You'll see the resemblance.
Hi, Len. Hi, David Silver. I think I met you in West Hartford, where I live, maybe 20 years ago. You were at Bethel. Anyway, and I'm also a graduate of Brandeis, 2 degrees. The first question was just about using what I call, non-technical word, dry data. We're talking about some very emotional, subjective issues, and how effective is using this kind of data and putting things into neat little categories for this kind of thing. That's number one. And the second one, I don't think any of us at this point could really ignore, the huge effect that COVID has had. Even if, let's say, hopefully it's waning, there's still this fear and this reluctance to get together. And, my slogan is, on a cold winter night, would you rather go out to a meeting or go to a service, or, curl up with your iPad? And I think the latter is in some ways more attractive, and what effect is that going to have? Are we going to go back to days of pre-COVID?
So two things. One on dry data. I hope I made it a little bit wet. And you know, I think while I was asked to talk about Pew, lots of my opinions are informed by my observations. We do lots of qualitative participant observation and interviews of actual people, and even my experiences, whether it's with with Temple Bethel or whether it's with other Jewish communities, is part of what I'm trying to reflect here. I think the advantage of questionnaires, surveys, is that you get a picture of a larger population of the people who you don't see in synagogue. You know the views of your synagogue members. You don't know the views of the next generation, other than your own children and your children's friends and so on. So getting these big pictures, just like, you know, the U.S. Census doesn't tell us who Americans really are. Political polls don't tell us what's going on. But you can put together a picture, and we put it together with other information. So I think there's a value for it. But I agree that it's only a piece of it. It's not the whole story. COVID. Right. I pivoted in March of 2020 to do a series of studies. We did 10 community studies, May to August of that year. And we've been continuing to collect data. So one of the things is Zoom a substitute for actual in-person engagement? Zoom is great. I mean, I can be where I am. Everybody can be at home, nice and warm on this cold night. I could be doing this with a community in Europe, in Israel. Well, not Israel, it's the middle of the night. California or whatever, we could, our reach is great. I think, however, just in terms of tonight's conversation, we are missing something. I really can't see people. I can't see your expression. You can't see mine. We can't schmooze over something, you know, some food before or afterwards, etc. There is something missing. Now, one of the things that we found out, and I'll give you just two of the things that we think we know. One is that Zoom works best for the people who already were engaged, for the people who already knew that they wanted to be part of a Jewish community, that they wanted to be part of a service. And I also think, and now that, especially during Omicron, when most congregations have stopped meeting in person, that you don't feel, when you can tune into a service anywhere in the country on Shabbat morning, if you're so inclined, and people who are so inclined are people who typically had the habit before. It hasn't brought in lots of new people. It's not going to work long term. And we've done some other studies, just like we've done some studies on campuses. Something is lost in Zoom learning. For people who have a storehouse of experiences, like if you know the students already, you can do things. When I went on Zoom with my students in late March and April of 2020, I already knew them, and it was simple. It was the next year when I had a bunch of students, 20 students around the country world, only one or two of whom I'd ever met. That was really tough. And you don't develop the kind of relationships that you do. The second thing is that we've been focused on this, is that older people, I won't define what that means, but older people seem to do much better with Zoom and with are coping better with COVID, despite the fact that older folks are more at risk for the serious health consequences of COVID than young people. We were able to see very early in COVID that the mental health issues that young people were facing skyrocketed. And later on, it's been confirmed with epidemiological work on suicide in young people. Just listen to Jamie Raskin's book. He narrates it. It is absolutely extraordinary. But the first part of it about his son's suicide is just wrenching. And something is different. And I think congregations are going to have to, and this, by the way, this is an opportunity. I don't like to talk about the problems as much as I want to talk about the opportunities. It is going to be an enormous opportunity for congregations to show that getting people together for real, panim al panim, face to face, interacting, etc., taking people on trips, whether you take them to Israel, whether you take them to Europe, whether you take them to wherever, being with other people, families getting together, is going to be an opportunity, not only a necessity, but it's going to be an opportunity to bring in people that haven't been part of your community before.
I, for one, can certainly relate to your comments about how COVID has affected people of different generations. Obviously, this is a story that goes well beyond Jews. Len, I want to thank you again, and I want to close with a question that's my question, and it brings us back to the conversation that several of us here had 10 days ago. And there were a lot of specific questions that we've addressed, that you addressed in your earlier comments, or you addressed in the follow-up, but there's kind of a meta question that I think is sort of underlying all of this. And the point was raised at that meeting that, when we're talking about Jewish continuity, it kind of pushes the envelope. What do we want to hold on to? What's important to hold on to? And I'd certainly, if you want to share your own opinion about what you think is important to hold on to, we'd love to hear it. But I want to ask, the question I really want to ask you is about data. And that is, are there data pointing to what's most important for Jews to hold on to in order to ensure continuity from one generation to the next? Or is it more a matter of each generation kind of, comes up with its own definition of what it means to kind of stay Jewish, and there are no real lessons?
Every generation has to figure it out.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know whether to deal with this philosophically or talmutically, if you will. I actually think that Jews, I'll just take some of the data that I showed. Jews are people for whom ethics, morality, and responsibility to other people is central. And I don't care whether you're Orthodox, whether you're Reformed, whether you're conservative, or you're not affiliated at all. Those are important things. And I have, I call them my ikarim of Judaism, my principles of Judaism. And the first one of them is amiyut, the sense of peoplehood, the sense of connection to other people. We live in a world where, individualism and is on steroids and is gone from being a kind of a national quality of Americans that made us successful in the world, to becoming a pathology where transactionalism has become the only thing that's important. How do I will get this because I pay for it, and how much I get is and how much I have is what I'm worth. And Judaism has always said something different. And I don't care whether you're ritually engaged or you're not ritually engaged. Judaism has suggested that we as people have a different relationship with one another. It's where our sense of responsibility comes for other people. And you know, we argue a lot because that's also, we are Yisrael. We are the people defined by struggling with, I'll call it the notion of God, the notion of Hashem. The Torah, Tanakh is for me anyway, two sides of the coin. We're hearing it's all about us and what we do. It's all about what God, what the world demands of us, if you will, and sets as our boundaries. So, I think, yes, we have to define the specifics of it. Like, when the rabbis got together and produced Talmud, they didn't have Zoom. They didn't have the kind of possibility for interaction that we currently have. So we have to operationalize it in a different way. But for me, the values and the fundamental principles and the argument about how to operationalize them, that is constant.
It's a really perfect way to end this wonderful program, to show sort of a core identity that cuts across Jews of all denominations, all types of involvement, is this sense of responsibility, ethics, argumentation, disagreement, wrestling with Torah, and all that. Len Saxe, thank you so much for your time. We've covered some great ground. I'm very appreciative of your generosity of what you know and what you think. And thanks to all of you